Okay, so now we turn to Brown and Rodriguez's article, School and the Co-Construction of Dropout. Remember, Betty's work focused on Chicana high school students in a non-college track program. This piece, though, focuses on the process of two male students dropping out of high school. Like Beatty's piece, we see the agency of individuals, the students and the educators specifically. We see how structures shape their experiences, how educators act as gatekeepers, and the power of perceptions and culture in shaping experiences. In 2016, the overall dropout rate was about 6% for those between the ages of 18 and 24. Asians had the lowest dropout rate of 3%, followed by non-Hispanic whites at 5% and African Americans at 7%. Hispanics had the highest dropout rate at 10%. Reasons for dropping out can be organized into two camps: individual level risk factors and institutional level risk factors. Individual level risk factors identify characteristics that a person has that makes them more vulnerable to dropping out. These include a person's race or ethnicity, their socioeconomic status, disability status, language proficiency, school-related disposition, and behaviors. We know, for example, that males, minorities, English as second language learners, and children with disabilities are at greater risk of dropping out of high school than their counterparts. There are also institutional factors that can contribute to dropout rates: a school's size, its location, the amount of resources a school has, the demographics of the student population at the school, the percent minority status, for example, and the percent qualifying for free and reduced lunch. We know that larger schools and schools with higher rates of students of color, as well as higher rates of students qualifying for free and reduced lunch, tend to have higher dropout rates than their counterparts. Actually, though, it is very hard to disentangle the impact of individual level or institutional level factors. The researchers for this article see the factors as linked. The interactions between the two types of factors come into play at school. Brown and Rodriguez's project tries to examine the interplay between both the individual and institutional level factors. So Fine conducted research on dropouts, and what he found was that schools exiled students in two ways. The first was by silencing them. Rather than address or acknowledge social inequalities like racism, discrimination, unfair discriminatory practices, and/or an inadequate curriculum, educators would take steps to not acknowledge those factors impacting children. Silencing students happens through alienating them from their culture, cutting them off from their home, heritage, lived experiences. This can take the form of using curriculum with which students can't relate, or demanding that students speak English, or deny children opportunities to be exposed to material and or narratives that reflect their norms, values, and ideologies. In this way, students are severed from the educational process. I'm going to give you a specific example to illustrate my point. In high school, we were taught about the Canterbury Tales. We had to memorize a portion of the Canterbury Tales in Old English. We were graded on that. We had to study the stories and learn why that literature was great. And to be clear, I loved school. I loved learning, and I remember enjoying those lessons and assignments. But I remember very clearly this one time in college, one of my literature teachers gave me the book, Bless Me Ultima. It wasn't an assignment, but it was a recommendation based on a conversation that I had with this professor. And I have to say, I was blown over by the novel. See, the novel was about a boy and this woman who I think of as his grandmother figure, but isn't. Her name was Ultima, and she was a curandera. In the story, there are references to hierbas and la lechuza. My grandmother was actually a curandera. She owned a hierberia, an herb store. People would bring herbs to my grandmother. We would dry them in our patio and cut the hierbas and package them. People would come to see my grandmother for help. And when I read the story, Bless Me Ultima, I was in awe of seeing the cultural references in the story that I knew about. I didn't have to have someone tell me why they were significant or what they meant. They were already a part of my culture, and I was so excited to read the book. I remember sharing it with everybody in my family and thinking, now this is great literature. And to make a long story short, That was when I realized that there is power and privilege in being able to shape what people learn about. Because for Bless Me Ultima, I could explain the things about the text that someone who was not Mexican or who had not grown up around yerbas and curanderas would not notice. Like I could be the authority and the person that could offer insight. And that's just one way that children can get silenced, by teaching and centering curriculum that does not start with what children are familiar with. They have limited stocks of knowledge upon which new knowledge can be scaffolded, and they don't see the way that they live, the knowledge that their families possess, the practices that their families engage in as culture or worthy of respect and dignity. They might actually feel shame that their parents don't, quote unquote, speak right or dress right or act right, etc. And so, having culturally relevant curriculum can actually draw students in and have them participate in their educational experiences and processes and contribute to them. Whereas having curriculum that doesn't speak to them in a way indirectly or consequentially silences them. Another way that students can be silenced is by exporting dissent, banishing or pushing out the students who could not be silenced, framing them as troublemakers or punishing them. Fine noted that dropouts weren't helpless, hopeless, or depressed, and they weren't necessarily academic failures either. Fine framed dropping out as an act of intellectual and political resistance, rejecting the institution. And with regard to the sociology of education, there has been relatively little research on dropouts. So I want to do a quick recap about some ideas related to symbolic interactionism and the framework used for this research. The features of culture embody the boundaries, categories, and rules in which meaning is negotiated. Culture is something that we enact. Every day, we either reinforce the norms, the rituals, the traditions, the structures, or we challenge them. And because schools are full of people with different organizational positions and resources and lived experiences, in the school setting, culture is where the struggle and tension of meaning making can exist. The student characteristics, being male, special education, first generation, low income, those aren't just attributes that, as you count them up, have the same impact on everyone. This approach to thinking about students, their successes and failures, ignores the role that structures, institutional biases, and processes, or even constitutive rules, play in a student's experiences at school. Dropping out was not the focus of the initial research project that led to this published paper. Rather, the researchers began their data collection during the 2003-2004 school year. They were working on two separate studies. One study focused on the technology use of high, medium, and low users. The other focused on academic achievement, focusing on GPAs and the Stanford 9 test scores. The intention of their research was not to study dropping out. Rather, this published project emerged out of relationships that had developed with these two students. There were 3 semi-structured interviews. They shadowed students on at least 4 occasions and had informal discussions. On page 227 of this article, you can find a description of the coding process and the informal discussions that they had. They followed the experiences of 2 students, Angel, who was a senior, and the other Ramon, who was a sophomore. Angel went to a school that had about 4,000 students, but was mostly low income and ethnically diverse. 60% of the students qualified for free and reduced lunch. He was 18 years old, 6 feet tall, and light complected, and Puerto Rican, though he moved to mainland United States at age 4. He was diagnosed with ADD and general anxiety disorder. He transferred to the school after being expelled from vocational school. Though he was held back in the 8th grade, he had passed his high school exam. And I want you to remember what we read from the conflict theory unit about students being expelled and students repeating grades. So we know that he's at risk for a host of reasons, right? Ramon attended a comprehensive school. It was predominantly low income, high minority. He was 17 years old, 5'7", light complected too. He also came from Puerto Rico at age 7, though the other one was at age 4. He was socially astute, attended an elite school before withdrawing from that school, and he had scored a 3 out of 4 on a nationally normed test and had already passed his exit exams. Both boys would have been eligible to graduate from high school had they stayed in school, but they didn't. In analyzing their data, the researchers identified 2 final themes that contributed to the boys dropping out of school. Both boys had experienced educational neglect, though in different ways. Angel thought he was incorrectly assigned to a class. He asked to be transferred. He asked his counselor, Mr. Ryan, if he could be transferred out of his classes. And Mr. Ryan, the counselor, said that it would take at least 2.5 weeks. Now, Angel ditched class because he figured he wasn't in the right class anyway. When he came back 2.5 weeks later, the counselor said he'd have to wait to have his schedule fixed till the next quarter or the next semester. The reality, though, was that the school was a full inclusion school where special ed students are not separated or tracked into different courses. They're actually integrated into regular classrooms, though. He was supposed to have what's called an individualized education plan. And so that is basically a tailored way of teaching and engaging with the student so that he can, be in one of those mainstream classrooms. So though he was a special ed student, there were no separate special ed teachers or special ed classes just for other like students like Angel and then other students like him. Angel, though, didn't have a good understanding of how his special education worked, nor did his parents. And the counselor didn't take the time to explain to him how his schooling was supposed to take place. And he was referred to another counselor or special ed teacher. And in all likelihood, that was because there were 39 special ed teachers to serve 400 students, which is a really high ratio. So they were probably overextended. But importantly, like no educator intervened to help Angel understand what was happening in his classes or with his aides. The shortcomings of the school and the choices that Angel made to not go to class together pushed Angel closer to dropping out. At the start of the new semester, only 2 changes were made to Angel's schedule, and he was seriously behind. Even one of his teachers, Mrs. Lee, had made the comment that somebody needed to speak to him, but she didn't assume that responsibility. He felt the school wasn't helping him, and he was right. It wasn't. But neither he nor his parents were advocating for himself either. And again, when you think about like how stretched the institution is, think about like multiple IEPs for each one of the classes that the students are taking. I mean, this is a huge workload. And, Anka's there trying to advocate on his behalf, not doing it very well. And then there's probably other parents as well who are also advocating for their children. And so given like the under-resourced nature of schools, you're much more likely to see school adults responding to parents who have cultural capital, right? They understand how to work within the institution. They're just one easier to accommodate, but also too, because they know the rules, there's a higher level of accountability should the school not follow the rules for their children. But there's not enough people, right, to help advocate at equal lengths for each of the children that need those resources. Now, Ramon's neglect was characterized as intellectual castration. He would point out the poor quality of teaching and curriculum. The researchers corroborated Ramon's assessment. They even observed teachers telling Ramon that other students' bad performances were because those students were associating with him. Uninterested teachers and unengaging curriculum played a role in him distancing himself from school. He often contrasted his experiences at this school with his schooling experiences in Puerto Rico, where he felt more seen and valued, and there was cultural consistency. He often said he didn't learn anything at this school. What's more, he would use the disciplinary policy that was in place to have an extended weekend for himself. The disciplinary policy was actually Ramon was actually manipulating it, and he was basically being rewarded for his misbehavior. Both students also experienced social and intellectual alienation. Angel felt powerless and was subjected to profiling and criminalization. He felt like an outsider. Recall that he had been held back in the 8th grade, so he was older than most students. He also felt that the school adults were prejudiced against Latinos and felt like he was under intense scrutiny by school adults. He had been in a fight, which led to an arrest and 1-year probationary period. And he was already a tall, large student, and school adults regularly questioned his being there anyway. While we think of schools as being safe places for kids, Angel felt vulnerable at school, but his cutting class also increased his chances of having negative interactions with hall monitors, security guards, police officers patrolling the school. Now, Ramon, by contrast, had an invisible presence. While he was unhappy with the school and made it known, he was popular among both the students and the adults. He knew school adults' names and they knew his. He was on campus but not engaged, and no educators assumed responsibility to work with Ramon so that he could find a place in the school that would be more challenging or more enriching or more fulfilling for him. Perhaps the kind of curriculum and school material that would appeal to Ramon's orientation didn't even exist. So, that wasn't explored in this piece. But again, while he was present on campus, he did not perform the good student role, but he was, again, affable and non-threatening enough that faculty and staff didn't engage him. And he would be engaged basically so that he could avoid working and conforming, which then also made it easier for him to disassociate with the school and ultimately drop out. Now, culture in schools, the culture in schools is one which tends to devalue marginalized voices. While Angel asserted he was not getting his needs met, he didn't do it in the way that educators or the administration heeded his claim. Nor did Angel have a parent who advocated on his behalf. His voice, his understanding, what was happening to him was devalued, and the devaluing contributed to his disengagement. That disengagement then affirmed the devaluation of the marginalized voice. The same can be said for Ramon's experience. He criticized the teachers for following the curriculum norm, for not, challenging him. And while his critique may have been valid, the way in which he critiqued his experiences wasn't done in a way that was valued or heeded by educators or administrators. There was a constant interplay between the structure, the culture, and the agency of the individuals interacting with one another. We can see that the constituted practice, the structures of the schools created conditions under which everyone acted. Extremely large schools can be efficient in holding large number of students in a relatively small geographic space, but extremely large schools are not an effective way of educating students, especially marginalized student populations. In large schools, it is much easier for students and teachers to have anonymity, to be just a number. And when you couple that with limited resources, like there not being enough counselors on campus or not enough special education teachers, the system creates conditions that lead people to behave in particular ways. For example, we learned from Riegel and Crum that the less traditional cultural capital children have, the more important counselors were to the educational experiences of children. Additionally, when you have 39 special education teachers for 400 students, and each student requires an IEP for all of their classes, that is a recipe for children falling through the cracks. That's more than 10 students per teacher, plus say 7 periods. That's more than 70 IEPs that the teacher has to keep track of. Logistically speaking, they cannot meet the needs of the students. And when you have parents with different levels of cultural capital, the kids with the parents who know how to and or can advocate for their children will be more likely to get the services they are entitled to than those without such parents. Those children will be left to advocate for themselves, like Angel, when they don't advocate in the right way, their needs are not met. And when we see the role that police have on campus, fights that 30 years ago might have been addressed in school suspension or after school detention, now the students have the potential of getting charges filed against them, like Angel did. Treating people of color more harshly in the external world filters into the students' world when police are on campus, especially if the campus is located in a community that is considered problematic. And finally, when the school mandates uninspiring, full, or meaningless curriculum, those students that are productive scholars and not docile scholars are going to be problematic and or disruptive. And if we remember Jackson's work, he says that doing well in school requires the mastery of the informal curriculum, the rules, the regulations, and routines, which Ramon refused to simply do. In fact, he pointed out how the curriculum to which he was exposed was a waste. Rather than address that, it was easier to let someone like Ramon disengage, right? This is that banishment part, because his continued presence may actually force school adults to have to think critically about what they are doing. So while these are only two students' stories, we can see how the tenets of symbolic interactionism may help us to understand the process by which students cool out or drop out of the education system. It isn't just an event, it is a process. What's pretty powerful to think about is how interventions can interrupt that progress, but the schools are not organized that way. They are organized in such a way that even if they don't openly acknowledge or celebrate students being expelled, there is the reality that students will be lost, and it's just accepted as a fact.